My name is Lisa Hajjar. I'm a visiting professor here this year at AUB, and I teach at UC Santa Barbara, and I will be your dominatrix for the next 2 hours. It's my pleasure to introduce this panel of distinguished speakers to get us going. I'm going to introduce them very briefly, not giving you their full array of accomplishments, and since you can read about that in the speakers' bios. So I will introduce them in the order in which they will be speaking. So first off, we have Bassam Haddad, who's the director of the Center for Middle East at George Mason and teaches in international affairs there. And perhaps many of you know him in his other capacity as the King of Jaraliyah. So the most crucial, one of the most crucial publications on the Middle East now. Bassam will speak first. The second speaker will be Joel Beinin, who teaches history at Stanford University and works extensively on Israel-Palestine, peasants, Egypt, etc., and is a longtime member of Middle East Report, another essential publication. The third speaker will be Abla Shehabi, who is Bahraini. She is an economist and one of the co-founders of Bahrain Watch. And the fourth speaker will be Abla Amawi, and she works for the United Nations Development Project in Palestine. So without further ado, Bassam.
Thank you, Lisa, and thanks everyone for coming. I'm very happy to be here and excited about this new endeavor and where this institute could be going. I am here to talk about, Syria, but I will probably be a bit disappointing because I will not be talking about what's happening right now, since many of us have been talking and hearing and reading about what is happening, and we are probably getting nowhere. My work and my paper for this conference is going to address the history of social transformation that led up to the uprisings as a way of understanding the dynamics and developments within the uprising, more so than to just analyze what is happening at the moment. The title is Structural Legacies and Dialectical Effects, Political Economy and the Syrian Uprising. So it's basically a book project that I'm starting with a paper here for this conference. And I would like to start by a couple words about a mentor, an ex-mentor, whom I'm very proud to have taken very many classes with, actually, and was inspired by. And that's, of course, Hanna Batatu. Social power, according to Hanna Batatu, is an indispensable starting point for most political analysis. He combines class, status, and community in his analysis of social power and makes it difficult to dismiss his work. His impeccably thorough field and archival work, especially in his work on Iraq, complements his careful analysis and produces a political history that illuminates far more than the object of the study at hand. It is often difficult to sum up what Batatu is saying, not because he doesn't make sense or is saying little, rather his work and conclusions are not amenable to sound bites, to game theoretic modeling, and to the simplistic philosophy of social science that many have adopted. However imperfectly, I have always aspired to research and write in the same breath. On January 11th, 2011, I completed nearly 15 years of fieldwork research in Syria on the topic of the new upper classes or strata of Syrian society, namely the three categories, including the state elite or the state bourgeoisie, the new economic elite or the rentier bourgeoisie, and the old bourgeoisie and remnants thereof. In my current paper and current second project, but specifically this paper, which I hope will come out of this conference, I trace the manner in which social power in Syria changed hands between the 1940s and 2010, how such patterns correlated dialectically, even if with a time lag, with forms of rule in Syria. I attempt to avoid determinism, but also to avoid overemphasis on agency, which is reflective of so much of how writers today approach the Syrian uprising. A good explanation, actually, for why we keep getting Syria wrong. I examine the connections between the social between social class, social alliances, social and economic policies, and socioeconomic outcomes. I conclude by paying particular attention to the social landscape that directly preceded the Syrian uprising in 2011. It is primarily in this last regard that my current paper connects with the more immediate concerns of this meeting. I will first address the broader context into which my research fits. The immediate part of my research addresses the social transformation, however, that Syria has undergone since the Ba'ath came to power in 1963, as well as its political articulations and consequences, a topic that underlies the mass mobilization we have been witnessing there. After Philip Khouri's seminal book and work on Syria during and directly after the mandate period, there has been very little by way of research that takes the long view. Especially lacking is fieldwork-based research that traces the origins and dynamics of social transformation after World War II. The new classes that emerged in Syria, developed, and still rule Syria, have their roots in the underclasses of the 1940s and 50s, where Khouri left off. It is their vision, struggles, internecine conflicts, and worldviews that governed the broader lines of Syria's politics today and society. And we are now witnessing the breakdown of this vision, but not its indelible effects, even with a political regime change in sight. Hence, this research is not bound to changes at the top. It accesses the slow-moving socio-political processes that have staying power beyond questions of regime change. I'll address the preliminary conception of the significant time periods that produced the current realities in Syria. I will address 4 time periods. The first, I start with the political dynamics of the liberal landed elite in the 1940s, directly preceding independence and shortly afterwards, with particular emphasis on their increased fragmented state of being, which allowed for other formulas to actually take hold. Second, I move to an examination of the impact of the United Arab Republic and the liberal coup and stint in power thereafter, lasting from 1958 to 1963. So much is made of the return of the Al-Azm's liberal government in 61, where in reality it was kind of the last vestige of Syria's liberal order. In fact, the significance of this return is that it hardened the coming political and social regimes by creating in their minds a zero-sum conception between state and society, that is after 1963. The third period addresses how social and political changes up to 1963 created a social and political vacuum that was captured by the lower middle classes, middle farmers in the rural areas, and their associates within various levels of the military. This period is the actual crucial period that I will be discussing between 1963 and 1970, discussing in the paper, not in this talk, refers to the rise of the political prominence of a new rural minoritarian elite, cross-sectional. It's not just one minority that had represented the underclasses prior to the 1960s. Not to be underestimated, if it is little understood, it was during these years that Syria experienced the marginalization sweep, what I call the marginalization sweep in the 1960s. So we experienced an era of successive and concomitant marginalizations, and I'll list some of them. The old liberal regime and its social correlates was marginalized. The middle class, urban, and cross-sectarian leadership of the Ba'ath Party was marginalized. The competing parties, from Nasirists to the communists and a coterie of other nationalists of all varieties, were marginalized. And finally, the ideologues of the Ba'ath Party, headed by Salah Jadid, were marginalized by the more pragmatic and careerist wing of the Ba'ath Party, led by Hafiz al-Assad. Unless we consider the political, social, and strategic implications of this period, we will neither understand the rise of the Assad regime, nor its sustenance, and nor, of course, its slow fall. Fifth and final period traces the socio-economic development of the emerging stratum and ruling elite in Syria and its organic and strategic networks with emphasis on its metamorphosis into a new economic elite, representing Syria's new upper classes after the 1970s. I address this period extensively in my current book, so I'll just emphasize a couple of important points. These social strata brought with them their own modes of exploitation and discipline, but were able to endure for decades as a result of a careful mixture of redistributive policies and repression. Over a period of nearly 3 decades, the new nexus between the political and economic elite produced economic policies that reversed the clock and redistributed wealth back from the bottom to the top, as opposed to the official narrative, which is the opposite. First, gradually through the 1990s, then the pace accelerated until the beginning of 2010 with the introduction of more bold, neoliberal-like economic policies. By 2011, the Syrian political elite had alienated most Syrians not living in the 2 major metropolitan cities, economically alienated them, while continuing to marginalize everyone politically. In due course, this rift broke the delicate social or societal balance that the regime rested on for decades. But the readiness to go to the street en masse was not high even at the start of the uprising in the south, which was largely prompted by the Egyptian and Tunisian examples. However, it was sufficient to mobilize publics, that is, the uprising early on was sufficient to mobilize publics just enough to allow the regime's brutality to catalyze the uprising henceforth. The game was transformed, however, from a domestic one to a regional and international one that became much more complex and acquired dimensions that have sometimes little to do with the history of Syria. And of course, the rest is history. But the emphasis here is on the idea that what we are witnessing today ends up monopolizing our conception of what's happening in Syria and why this is taking place. But that is not the case. What is happening today in Syria is a function of many dynamics that actually entered into, so to speak, into the conflict. And we end up focusing so much on certain factors and varieties, which I do as well. I focus on from Qatar to Jabhat al-Nusra, to Turkey, to the SNC, to Burhan Ghalioun, and so on, and that's all important. But it cannot take place at the expense of 40 or 50 years of historical, political, economic, and social legacies that actually present the background to what is happening today. So the tally, the balance sheet, cannot be a product of what happened between March 2011 and today. It must incorporate the other factors, which is one of the reasons why it is time, in my view, to go back in history and stop tracing which military base Jabhat al-Nusra or Ahrar al-Sham were able to take and which military base was actually retaken by the regime, which is all important at some level, but this is not really giving us a lot of knowledge. The Syrian uprising. The stalemate in Syria going beyond 2 years now is indicative of a need for a more nuanced and multifaceted historical and political economic analysis as a result of the causes of the conflict. Though it is important to distinguish in the case of Syria, again, between what caused the uprising and what sustains it, because these might be very different things, which is a methodological point and requires like a paper unto itself. Instead of surveying the gamut of factors and claims about the causes of the uprisings, I examine a factor that has been given scant attention despite its centrality. The social form I am discussing here refers to the growing and special relationship in the past few decades between the political and economic elite in the countries undergoing mass uprisings, certainly in the case of Syria. This nexus of power pervades most global political economies but produces deleterious effects to the extent that the context allows. Examining this connection rigorously helps us understand why the uprisings took place in some countries and not others, and how they proceeded, at least at the outset. It is one thing to refer to this nexus or factor, but it's another to show how and why it played a decisive role in tipping the balance. This is what I try to do in my work, in the conclusion of my book actually, and what I will try to develop from a historical perspective in my current paper. I tried to do this in an article I wrote for Carnegie. Sorry, Yazid. You'll see why. I tried to do this in an article I wrote for Carnegie in 2010, but they wouldn't publish it, even though I was a visiting scholar there. It was then published by Middle East Policy anyway. The reason it was not published was because it was speaking of a social ticking bomb in Syria as a result of the progress of the social dynamics I discussed there, ones that include but are not limited to neoliberal-like economic policies and things of the sort. Of course, the Assad regime in both its incarnations. At the same time, at that time, in 2009 and 10, folks were too busy celebrating what international financial institutions' publications said about the success of the Tunisian and Egyptian case. My piece was a downer because it attempted to unearth the problematic social relations on which whatever edifice of success or failure rested, whether it's in Egypt, Tunisia, Syria, and elsewhere. If you recall the beginnings of the Syrian uprising, the call of protesters was in large measure directed at the abuse of political power for economic gain, with tycoons like Rami Makhlouf, the president's cousin, and someone who's set to own and or control a plurality of the larger economic ventures in the private sector in Syria. These calls reflected the connection between such figures and what they represent in terms of power and abuse of power on the one hand, and the gradual decline of the distributive functions of the state since the late 1980s, and the accelerated rate of subsidies withdrawal after 2005, on the other hand. In other words, it's important to look at the real policies that tipped the balance in Syria that existed, which I would like to talk about in a second. In the case of Syria, analysts underestimate the extent to which this distributive function, or what I call leveling egalitarianism, where nearly everyone is equally disadvantaged economically, has held together Syria's much-touted social peace. The social peace that the regime used to speak about is not a fantasy. It is a reality of sorts. It's a very problematic reality in the sense that it's based on problematic things, but there was some sort of leveling egalitarianism in the 70s and 80s and part of the 90s, which began to be shattered in the 90s and 2000s, especially after 2005, when subsidies that were the last resort of people were actually slashed. In that sense, such factors played a significant role in Syria compared to states like Tunisia and Egypt, where the transition from a state-centered political economy to a more mixed and neoliberal-like political economy started earlier and was accompanied by more prominent political and or discursive shifts to support that transition. Thus, Syria was more vulnerable precisely because of higher expectations regarding distribution and redistribution and the prevalence of a sense of entitlement vis-a-vis state subsidies. This is why the post-2005 slashing of subsidies pushed most economically marginalized Syrians over the edge. I will jump to my conclusion. I discuss the actual things that took place in Syria that actually marginalized a large number of Syrian society, especially after 2005. I will close by a reference to two processes, events, and I'll summarize in the case of Syria that tipped the balance against the status quo and allowed the relative success of the prior uprisings to instigate mass protests in Syria for the first time in decades. So I'm not talking about a reductionist political economic variable that explains the uprising. I'm talking about an important structural dimension without which we cannot understand the timing of the uprising as well as its limited nature as opposed to in Tunisia and Egypt. So the first element is the relationship between the political and economic elites since 1986 and its policy outcomes. This relationship is a central cause for destabilizing the delicate social balance there. The result was not only a growing gap between rich and poor, the coming together of state and business elites in Syria produced a huge gap between rich and poor, which sounds like a cliche, but it is true statistically. And it produced the gradual decimation of the distributive state. Not only did it do so, but it also stripped many Syrians, especially outside the metropolitan cities, of what they saw as the most basic entitlements. The economic fate of more than 60% of Syrians deteriorated gradually since state business networks literally hijacked the process of economic policy making after 1986. The post-2005 period, as I mentioned, where the state withdrew the last line of defense, state subsidies, left most Syrians without any recourse for making ends meet. Still, this was not cause for mass uprisings. There were other factors that played a role. Second, which is a very overlooked factor in the case of Syria, nobody talks about it because everyone is so busy talking about more sexy and sensationalist things. Second, the drought between 2003 and 2010, caused by scant rainfall, contributed immensely to the mass mobilization during the first 6 months of the uprisings when the movement was more rural. More than 1.5 million Syrians were displaced since 2003. 1.2 million Syrians were displaced since 2003 as a result of the drought. And note that more than 30% of Syria's labor force, worked within or in the orbit of the agricultural sector, which means in the case of the United States, statistically speaking, more than 100 million people were affected. The effects of the drought were detrimental, however, not just because it's a natural disaster, of course it's a natural problem, but they were detrimental precisely because of the urban-centered and consumption and trade-heavy policies and policy outcomes associated with the elite nexus I discussed. In other words, it's also a problem outside the natural problem. There's a problem of management of resources. There's a problem of not just corruption, but serious abuse of power for economic gain in a way that is far deeper than the World Bank notion of corruption. By 2011, there was very little else by way of safety nets in Syria's economy and society that could compensate for this social imbalance. I'll close. It is not that these factors are determinant in and of themselves. It is the manner in which they interacted with and occurred in a social and political landscape that outlived its purpose and irreversibly stretched its legitimizing discourse. The social and economic contradictions that developed were stark and mixed with pent-up communal factors that produced an especially volatile terrain. In some parts of Syria, predominantly the countryside and most areas outside the two metropolitan cities, all that was needed was a spark. With the Tunisian and Egyptian uprisings in the background, the spark was easy to come by and light up various parts of Syria. However, only a thick reading of Syria's political and economic history may explain why the spark did not engulf all of Syria in its flames 2 years into a bloody and costly uprising. I mean, there still is a state of sorts, even if it's being emptied out. There still is support among real people in Syria for the status quo, if not the regime. And I don't need to make these caveats here as I would in Washington, for instance, because people understand why some people in Syria still support not the regime or Bashar, but basically either the status quo or support the opposite of what they see as an alternative. My paper traces meticulously those social and economic factors to address these causes and to address the stalling dynamics of the uprising in Syria. Thank you.
We're having a slight change in order. Abla Shehabi will speak next.
Thank you, AUB, for inviting me today and encouraging this activist scholar engagement. And I'd like to say that my presentation will focus on more practical experience as an activist and as an academic who was forced to resign from their job because I decided to take part in the revolution. And it will talk a lot about what it means to be part of a revolutionary process and how I then felt in real practical terms that there was a discourse that was imposed upon me. So first of all, I began to be described as a human rights activist, and although that's as noble as that would be, but I never conceived myself or my identity along those terms. And then how I then began to speak to the media along certain particular lines, and then we realized that we were banging our heads against a brick wall just through using the human rights discourse, because that constantly made us appeal to the state, focus on abuses rather than focus on the political aims and the demands of the revolution. So that's kind of where the motivation for this paper is, and I don't hide my agenda, and I'm very proud to say that's what motivated this paper, and it's going to be submitted for publication and merit. At the moment, I feel that the Bahrain's revolution is really teetering on the brink at the moment. It's been facing a 2-year crackdown, and despite that crackdown, there's still this an immense amount of inertia, but we're talking about a counter-revolution that's had 2.5 years to reconfigure its security apparatus and use the latest digital surveillance and infiltration mechanisms to really, force this revolution to an end. But in terms of the subject of this panel and the subject of this conference about the conceptions of citizenship, so going back to the roots of the uprising that precede the February 14th, 2011 start of the revolution, all the way back to at least 100 years. This is a paper that was recently unearthed a couple of weeks ago, and it's written by the political resident in the Persian Gulf. And he's advising the ruler of Bahrain back in April 1922 that your subjects became restive and petitioned me and the high government. You yourself undertook to introduce some reforms to ameliorate their condition. But my friend, you have never introduced any reform either at the urgent request of the government or in fulfillment of your own promises. So the context of the uprising comes against the backdrop of promises and pledges of reform for the past 100 years. In the context of today's uprising, I see revolution defined as a process where there is a revolution, as Asif Bayat defines it, in terms of movement and in terms of change. So yes, revolution, there hasn't been political change, there hasn't been a change in the political system itself, but we're talking about revolutionary movements, the change in the social landscape in civil society. So that's in which, when I refer to the word revolutionaries and revolution, I'm really referring to the movement, the changes that we've seen over the past 2.5 years. And the key players in the revolutionary faction, the opposition, and here I discard mostly the mainstream authorized opposition, the biggest political party, Al-Wafaq, is authorized under the system. But here I'm talking about the radicals. I'm here to analyze really the ones at the fringe who are really on the front line. So within that fringe, there is the traditional opposition, people of my father's generation, who are what I call the old radical flanks. They've always been on the edge, always demanding really their political demands have always been very radical in calling for either the downfall of the regime, or actually what happened during the Pearl Roundabout in February 2011 was they called for a republic. So in Bahrain, we've seen the birth of a republican movement, a movement that's saying we can conceive a political state in the GCC, in the Gulf, in these petro-monarchies that is free from absolute monarchy. And maybe, in fact, after 100 years of demanding a constitutional monarchy, maybe it's time we can conceive the possibility of a republican system in the Gulf. This was even as those being on the protest couldn't really conceive the possibility that you can imagine the Gulf without sheikhs, which is the headline of Christopher Davidson's book, After the Sheikhs. So definitely one of the results of the uprising is you can conceive a Gulf without political ruling families. Whether it's a reality, whether it's pragmatic, it's a different issue. In terms of the street revolutionaries, we have the February 14th movement. This is a broad movement, but within it, it's really organized locally at the grassroots level with over 50 groups dispersed across the country, and organizing really, because the government removed the central Pearl Roundabout, people were forced back into their local communities, and they organized along those lines. And thirdly, another big important group in the revolution is human rights activists. Yes, human rights activists can become revolutionaries. And I think this is going to be the focus of my discussion, to see what are the lines and the boundaries around human rights activism. Firstly, we're really fighting the battle of narrative when it comes to the coverage of Bahrain and the description of what's happening in Bahrain. You'll see terms being used, and I'm very conscious of the way these terms are used and the way they are imposed on the opposition itself, let alone on the media. Words like reform, or specifically security sector reform. I see the word security sector reform as being another word for a counter-revolution in very nice terms, in a way that the West can employ to say, look, Bahrain's changing. They are carrying out security sector reforms. They are seeking our advice. They must be good. We then begin to appropriate that term, and we begin to use it. Yes, we call for reforms, so then we're actually feeding into the same agenda there. The other thing is dialogue. We hear it a lot in Syria, we're hearing it a lot in Bahrain, dialogue. And if we say, yes, we have to fight for who really wants dialogue, what does dialogue mean? Again, that distracts and delays the process of change. Rather than, everyone knows what the changes are, what can dialogue do what do you want to discuss? What do you want to negotiate on? What do you want to compromise? And that, again, for the revolutionaries, it's a bit problematic. Then the final issue with this hegemonic discourse is by focusing on the human rights discourse. Yes, 10 people were arrested last night arbitrarily. There's torture in prisons. All of the bad things that you hear, all of the abuses, you will never hear what Bahrainis actually want, what their political demands are. The media, the Western media, Western governments are more than happy to depict and portray the laundry list of abuses. There's no problem with that, as long as you keep appealing to the authority to reform and to change and to carry out the changes that you need. But if we keep doing that, myself as a human rights activist, I don't believe in the legitimacy of the authority, so why do I keep appealing to them? And I go around in a vicious circle that way. So then again, the other thing, the PR, on the other hand, the regime adopts around 20, employed in 2012, around 20 public relations organizations to really distort the narrative around that the revolutionaries are a minority, they're troublemakers, they're militants, they're radicals, they're extremists, for calling for really radical change in governance. So then we have this issue of where the mainstream opposition party, in adopting that kind of discourse, reform, dialogue, human rights, they have begun to refrain from any direct criticism of the king. And they didn't realize that they have only done that because they've adopted that kind of discourse that was imposed. So that's where you find as an activist, you're lost in this kind of narrative. But then ultimately you think, well, I know where physically, I know where the red line is. If I write on my Twitter account, down with King Hamad, I can be prosecuted tomorrow. But if I talk about the abuses in human rights from now and for another 10 years, that's fine, I can be set free. So really, that's how I've defined the reasons and the justifications for the arrest of many friends and for many activists like Nabil Rajab, who many of you probably will know. He broke that red line. He said, I do not believe in the legitimacy of this authority. Maybe the king needs to think about abdicating or whatever. That was the red line that human rights activists couldn't cross. And he's found himself in prison for that. Going back to the street revolutionaries, again, from my personal observations over the last 2.5 years, we have, in the beginning, I thought this is a huge movement. It's secret. It's gone underground because of the repression. But you can't really hide in a country like Bahrain. Like, it's a tiny island, so you can travel and visit the whole island in about an hour. How can we have an underground movement, as we've come to realize over the last 2 months? Through the use of digital surveillance, through actually really bad security measures by activists like myself. And I've also received digital surveillance technology in my email, and I found myself actually prosecuting not the Bahraini government, but the British government in the UK for exporting the digital surveillance to activists in Bahrain. There's nowhere you can really hide. So what started off, it went underground, but really, if you wear a balaclava in a protest, 2 minutes you're buying, a can of Coke from the cold store, and there's a CCTV camera, you're easily, your identity is very difficult. So there has been a lack of training in urban warfare. They've faced incredible security crackdown, and it's starting to teeter at the moment. But within them, the discourse that this February 14th Youth Coalition use, it's really in Arabic. It's a very different discourse. It's not the human rights discourse. It's about thawra, it's about muqawama, it's about sumud, it's about resistance, resilience. That's the kind of discourse they use internally, and that's how they speak to the constituency. Okay, carrying on. So again, I think the reason why actually the Bahraini opposition movement has seen an advocacy revolution. We are probably the biggest movement in the Arab world that's focused on human rights. Relatively speaking, we've got 10 new human rights NGOs and only 3 new political groupings. Everyone is a human rights, sees themselves and can identify with being a human rights activist. It's brought great benefits, great organization on social capital amongst civil society actors. There's been a lot of learning. There's been the rise of a lot of youth and female activists. It's really empowered the opposition and given victims a voice. But then again, the Bahraini regime has also engaged in human rights, and it's also learned how to subvert the human rights, international human rights instruments. So, for example, in September 2012, Bahrain was being reviewed in the Human Rights Council last year. The opposition sent around 70 to 80 delegates to Geneva, and the regime sent about 100. The battleground was being done in the Human Rights Council, which is not an instrument that can prevent any of either the, it doesn't have any enforcement mechanisms that can actually prevent human rights abuses on the ground, but that was being seen as an important battlefront. And it's also limited in what it can do. So are we fighting on the wrong front when we just really focus on human rights? Again, that was another observation. But then I move on to think more broadly that this is really a neoliberal conception of human rights. It's almost an anti-politics. In focusing on human rights, you remove any depth of discussion of the actual politics in the country. Bayat describes this kind of the new revolutions as, in place of terms like the state or revolution, we talk about civil society, public spheres. We'll talk about in Human Rights Watch type reports where we can describe something, but in our recommendations we appeal to the abuser of the human rights themselves, and therefore we really re-legitimize that. And so by removing any of that, the political depth in the use of human rights discourse, you begin to feel that you're banging your head against the wall, and these Human Rights Watch reports, as great as they may be, aren't going to really push the political boundaries in the country. And this is an example of how I say that this is my friend and compatriot, Mariam Khawaja, someone I'm very proud of. But this is, just watch very carefully how the BBC presenter questions her in this program. And this is really what inspired me to think about this subject. Sorry, how do I click on play?
March 2011, the height of the protests in Bahrain, where you referred to your return to the country just a few days before, and you said, I came back after the revolution started. Do you still see yourself as a Bahraini revolutionary?
Well, I think we characterize ourselves more specifically as human rights defenders. In countries where you have authoritarian regimes, automatically as a human rights defenders, you're considered one of the worst enemies of the government. And so you automatically become part of the revolutionary process that takes part in these countries. And as such, looking at it from that perspective, I guess yes, we are regarded as being part of the revolutionary process in the country.
Yeah, I see that it is important to differentiate between being a human rights campaigner and a revolutionary, because if you really see in the end your ultimate goal to be achieved only through the overthrow of the current regime in Bahrain, then it's hardly surprising that the sorts of reforms the Bahraini government has made in the last few months are never going to be acceptable to you, because you have made the decision that that regime must go, yes?
No, actually, as a human rights organization, our stance has always been very specific and very public. And our stance has always been that as a human rights organization, we do not call for the change of the regime. We do not call for a specific political government. So we don't call for a democracy or a republic or a constitutional monarchy. Our stance is that we're calling for a government that respects human rights, that institutionalizes human rights, and that grants people their rights as citizens.
So you can see from that, just that small clip, how that discourse has really forced the activists to be very defensive, to say that, we don't have any political demands actually, we're not calling, it's a very, from that perspective, how do you speak to the media, what do you say? If I cross that line, I find myself in a prison, but I also find myself without any allies. I'm all alienated from the international community because I've crossed the red line. And this is exactly what happened to Mariam's father, who called for, one of the people that called for a republic, and for Nabil Rajab, who also made very critical statements of the government. So, when you embody and you take on that narrative and that discourse, it really restricts you, and it's almost a counter-revolutionary process that you think you're being antagonistic, but you re-legitimize and find yourself in a corner. And really, I can end here, I've got many more slides, but I can end here to say, really, we find ourselves cornered as activists in the corner because of this kind of discourse and narrative, and the boundaries are lost, the bigger issues are lost. This is an uprising that's focused on land and the property question, about a small elite that that's corrupt and it expropriates the wealth of the population, and it's fundamentally about inequality and justice. And the danger is that if you are focused on the human rights discourse, you delineate those boundaries and you move those key essential questions that were the cause of the many of the Arab Spring revolutions across the Arab world. And that's the point in which I want to conclude. But finally, just to show you that this is how the Bahraini revolution actually started. Human rights have always been bad in Bahrain, but here you'll see a protester. You'll see a protester. You can't see it, but he's carrying a one Bahraini dinar in front of the central financial district. The Prime Minister brought those two skyscrapers in the land in which they are built on for about $3. And this was really the reason why the Bahrainis took to the streets, and why as much as human rights abuses are bad, but the big political questions about the distribution of wealth, about inequality, injustice, are about the royal family's real kind of hegemony and expropriation of wealth in the country. So we have to not fall into that trap, and I think that's going to be the key argument of my paper. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. So I'm never going to get Lisa to call me Joel Beinin, even though she knows me for half of her life. So thank you to AUB and to the organizers of this event. It's a great pleasure to be back here in Beirut for the second time in 2 months. Those of you who know anything about what I have written about for the last 2 years, it's almost all of it about labor in Egypt, and very much a parallel to what Bassam said about business associations and the liberalization of the Syrian economy having to do the background. So I'm not going to talk about that. I mean, just to put in your mind that this was a movement of enormous proportions, millions of people and their families taking part from the late 1990s up through the overthrow of Mubarak, and then continuing until this day, even at a far more escalated level. The other thing I'm not going to talk about, because other people have spoken about it a great deal, is the more middle-class intelligentsia's oppositional movements, Kifaya and all of that. Just have to assume that that's in the background and there. And what I'm going to do is to try to focus on a more conceptual understanding of these things, something I usually don't do as a historian. One aspect of the Arab uprisings of 2011 that was little noticed by scholars and pundits is the small role, except that Abla just pointed it out, is the small role of non-governmental organizations and legal opposition parties in mobilizing the demonstrations and occupations of public space that were the emblematic expressions of the movement. Some NGOs, trade unions, professional associations, and political parties recognized by the old regimes eventually joined in, but in no case did they initiate the mobilizations. Except for the qualified success of human rights NGOs and trade unions in Morocco and Bahrain, legal opposition parties and NGOs never became effective, enduring structures of social mobilization during the era of ascendant Arab authoritarianism. The proliferation of NGOs and the creation of a permitted and closely supervised sphere of public political activity may even have contributed to depoliticization by providing...
Sorry, you're scaring the translators.
Oh, I'm sorry. By providing politically inclined middle-class professionals with a relatively safer area of activity which did not involve mobilizing significant elements of the population in demonstrations or campaigns that directly challenged the regimes. The historical record would seem to contradict the expectations of the transitologists who argued that the reason for the non-participation of the Arab region in the third wave of democratization from the mid-1970s to 1989 was that Arab states dominated their societies. They argued that the corrective to this syndrome was building civil society. This was supposed to recalibrate the balance between the state and society and open a path for a transition to democracy. For proponents of this view, NGOs were the quintessential expression of civil society. But as Bruce Cummings argues, this concept of civil society is often based on a false notion of a Western civil society where well-informed citizens debate the important questions of politics and the good life without fear or favor, in contrast to the limited democracies, authoritarian systems, and general illiberalism of the global South. This imagined civil society is a far cry from the character of actually existing public political discourse in the United States, which I personally would characterize as infantile. Civil society is a contested zone. States and ruling elites actively intervene in civil society by establishing the ground rules according to which NGOs, trade unions, professional syndicates, and other associations may function, and most importantly, by attempting to ensure that the constituted order and its hegemonic ideology are perceived as legitimate. States and ruling elites seek to exclude from what they delimit as legitimate civil society ideas and institutions that would pose a radical challenge to the existing order. Consequently, in Egypt, Tunisia, and most other Arab states, NGOs that were deemed to be improperly political were declared illegal or denied registration. Similarly, political parties based on religion or class or which crossed other red lines were banned. Variation in the extent and the severity of regulation and discipline of civil society may reflect the qualitative difference between authoritarianism and democracy, but the existence of civil society per se, and even the existence of a large number of so-called civil society organizations, is not necessarily an index of progress towards democracy. Ireland and Poland are exemplary cases where the existence of a space beyond Iran and Poland are exemplary cases where the existence of a space beyond the reach of authoritarian regimes contributed substantially to regime change. But the Shi'i clergy and the Catholic Church did not turn out to be reliable guarantors of democracy, and the Sunni Islamist forces who have come to power in Egypt and Tunisia are likely to fall far short as well. Democracy results from a political and social struggle among various forces in a given society. Can we imagine the expansion of democracy in the United States without the abolitionists, John Brown, the Civil War, Malcolm X, the Black Panther Party, and Martin Luther King Jr., who people who talk about this at all will typically only mention him because of the commitment to nonviolence. Civil society and democracy atrophy when those struggles subside or are actively repressed. It becomes more substantive and more deeply rooted when they are more intense, but mainly civil. There was a proliferation of NGOs in the Arab region from the mid-1980s on, but this was not necessarily evidence of the resurgence of civil society or any sort of transition to democracy. Writing before the uprisings of 2011, Shadi Hamid of the Brookings Institute Doha Center, who personally energetically supports funding of Arab NGOs and active engagement in democracy promotion by both private U.S. foundations and quasi-governmental agencies, which I do not support, argued, even pro-democracy NGOs are not, in fact, pro-democracy NGOs. Democracy entails alternation of power, but most NGOs that favor democratization do not do anything that can be construed as supporting a change in the regime. One of the reasons for this is that the original impetus for the formation of NGOs was the political defeat of the Arab New Left and the Islamic revival in the 1970s and 1980s. This led to the retreat of Arab urban intelligentsias from secular party politics. Leftists and liberals who sought to continue political activity founded and joined advocacy NGOs promoting human rights, prisoners' rights, women's rights, children's rights, workers' rights, and so on. The defeat of the Arab New Left was a regional expression of a broad trend in the advanced capitalist countries, symbolized by the ascension to power of Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain and Ronald Reagan in the United States. Supported by what Pete dubbed the unholy trinity, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization, they sought to roll back both European social democracy and the American New Deal, and in the global South, economic nationalism of all sorts. In Egypt, by 2010, there were perhaps as many as 30,000 NGOs. Over half of them were either Islamic or Coptic NGOs. Another quarter of them were community development associations, which are quasi-governmental entities. There were also business associations and several dozen secular, liberal, and left-oriented advocacy NGOs. The Ministry of Social Affairs, now the Ministry of Social Solidarity and Justice, registers and licenses NGOs and monitors their budgets and activities as stipulated by the Law on Community Associations and Foundations, Law 84 of 2002, and before 2002, the regulation was according to Law 32 of 1964. Typically, business associations, while nominally subject to the same requirements of registration and regulation, were treated with a light hand. To the extent that these advocacy NGOs actually challenged authoritarian norms and practices in the Mubarak era, they were harshly repressed. For example, the Arab Women's Solidarity Association was dissolved by an administrative decree after it criticized the regime's support for the US-led coalition in the 1991 Gulf War. The Egyptian Organization for Human Rights and the New Women's Research Center were denied legal registration. The Egyptian Organization for Human Rights was eventually registered, but the 2003 court order directing that the New Women Research Center be duly registered remained unimplemented through the end of the Mubarak era. The Ibn Khaldun Center and its director, Saadeddin Ibrahim, professor of sociology emeritus at the American University in Cairo, were targets of exceptional hostility. Despite his dual Egyptian-US citizenship, Ibrahim was imprisoned for over 2 years between 2000 and 2003 on entirely spurious charges. For those NGOs who were permitted to function in Egypt as in other Arab countries before and after 2011, the internal security forces commonly supervised their activities, harassed their leaders, and intervened to block their legal registration. Consequently, several Egyptian NGO-like associations were established as nonprofit companies to avoid the strictures of registration. This did not, however, prevent the Egyptian government from closing the Center for Trade Union and Worker Services for a year in 2007-2008. All indications are that the post-Mubarak government intends to impose even tighter strictures on the operations of NGOs, especially those that receive international funding. In March of this year, the Shura Council drafted a law on civil work entities, which the United Nations and European Union human rights experts have already criticized quite sharply. Similarly, in Tunisia, the regime regulates NGOs quite heavily. I'm not going to get into the details of that for reasons of time, because I'm already told that I'm using too much of it. But one big difference between Egypt and Tunisia, worth noting, is that the Egyptian Trade Union Federation was and remains an institution of the state, where the Tunisian General Federation of Labor, the UGTT, retained a certain degree of autonomy regarding local workplace issues, even though it was compelled to endorse the overall neoliberal strategy of the Ben Ali regime. The fallacy of imagining that NGOs would bring about a transition to democracy is most evident in Libya and Syria, which may turn out to be the cases of the most thoroughgoing post-2011 Arab regime change, although the extent of their democratic content is uncertain. In Libya, NGOs barely existed before 2011. Most of Syria's 1,500 NGOs, the lowest number in the Arab region, are charities. The 2011 Arab popular uprisings were not the result of proliferating NGOs or the expansion of civil society. Rather, they were the consequence of converging vectors of diverse social movements in formation over the previous decades, involving urban intelligentsias, blue and white-collar workers and professionals, disaffected tribes, oppressed religious communities, and marginal regions. We can speak of a revolutionary movement for democracy and social justice that enveloped the Arab world in 2011 on a scale comparable to Latin America in the 1820s and Europe in 1848 and 1989. But the combination of forces, the dynamics of mobilization, the historical and political contexts, the framing of the most salient issues, the extent and nature of foreign intervention are all specific to each country. So I don't think I have time to make what I think might be the most punchy point here, so I'll just summarize it in a bit. In Egypt, and I think also in Tunisia, the two I think are quite comparable. We can speak of two or perhaps three parallel social movements that culminated in the popular uprisings. One, a workers' movement. Two, alongside it, a movement of urban oppositional intelligentsia, which was, generally speaking, quite detached from the workers' movement for a number of reasons. And three, a movement by what has been called the Facebook youth, which are an extension of, in some cases, or similar social forces as the oppositional urban middle-class intelligentsias. The Facebook movement has received more than its due share of recognition in the West because they are perceived to be people like us, that is, using Western technology, fluent in English, speaking in political terms to the extent that they spoke in political terms at all that are tolerable for the West. And what's interesting is the extent to which in Egypt, in Tunisia, and elsewhere, those very people who had the least to do with the actual social movements on the ground that were the more important incubators of the uprisings have been co-opted by various Western agencies, public and private, encouraged to establish NGOs to build civil society, and been brought into the broader neoliberal program of the international financial institutions and the government of the United States. So this co-optation in the name of building civil society is, in fact, one of the several tools, along with the continuing alliance of the United States with the Egyptian army, along with the United States government's embrace of the neoliberalism of the Muslim Brothers, which is intended to ensure the continuation of the status quo and to block the revolutionary upsurge which appeared in 2011. Thank you very much.
Amawi.
Well, I would like to thank AUB, and I thank the Institute for this very interesting meeting. I think for me it's difficult to start after all the discussion already, but I will be talking about this Jordan and whether what we will have in Jordan will lead to, in terms of the political crisis, will lead to a revolutionary situation. I think what we see in the media is where will Jordan go? Why is Jordan avoiding the domino effect? Why nothing is happening in Jordan despite all the demonstrations that are taking place in Jordan? So these questions are asked also touch on the nature of the political regime, the nature of the opposition, the nature of societal groupings, the nature of the historical linkages between Jordan and the US and the different allies. So what we will see in Jordan is, and this is where I will start, is that since 2010 we had the beginning of the demonstrations that have asked, or what we call political unrest, and these were starting as small scale. They were made up of divergent groups, East Bank Jordanians, and here I will try to avoid using the term trans-Jordanians. And when we speak of Jordan, it's not easy to speak of the different groups that are composed in Jordan, which is the East Jordanian of East Bank origin and Jordanians of West Bank origin. It's easier in Jordan because we say Jordanian, which means that you're real Jordanian, as opposed to what they perceive as the unreal Jordanians, meaning Jordanians of Palestinian origin. So these demonstrations combined the East Bank Jordanians, the Jordanians of Palestinian origin, Islamists, as well as independent youth groups. This is the beginning of the recent, because we have to separate it between what took place previously, but at least since 2010. The demonstrations escalated in 2011, and one of the most, what we call the watershed event, was the Jayin movement, or coming back, which is a coalition of workers, pensioners, teachers, students, nationalists, and left-wing groups. So what was interesting about this conglomerate of different groupings is that for the first time they were East Bank Jordanians. And this was the one watershed for the regime and for everybody actually to start watching what is taking place in Jordan, because they constitute the backbone of the Jordanian regime, and they started from a southern city of Diban. So these sort of signals are very, very important. Now, the demonstrations escalated in terms of size and scope, and touched upon everything related to issues of corruption, issues of the failure of the economic system actually to enable the state to have equitable growth and ability to reduce the inequality in Jordan. Secondly, there were issues of requesting political reform, but most of the demands focused on economic reform, issues of unemployment, issues of the youth bulge, and how can we actually address the inability of the economy to absorb new graduates. So these were the initial demonstrations in 2010-11, leading to the largest one was over the lifting of subsidies related to the fuel, and the government response was they had to do this because the IMF would not give the loan to Jordan. But these were the massive demonstrations that reminded us of the demonstrations of the bread riots in '89. So what we see here is, and this is where this introduction will lead to, is the state in Jordan fragile state or resilient? And I find this question actually very interesting, because with Dr. Hudson sitting here, years ago I did my dissertation on the formation of the state in Jordan, and at the end of it, Dr. Shehabi and Dr. Hudson asked me, is Jordan a state? So I found now, to speak about the viability or fragility, resilience of the Jordanian state means that I did answer the question at the time that Jordan is a state. It constituted all the elements of a state in a Weberian sense, in terms of territory, in terms of ability of to have a continuous bureaucracy, efficient administration, and monopoly over the use of force. I will come to each of these aspects now to dissect them actually, and in seeing whether the Jordanian state will survive or will not survive in terms of the regime, not the state. So in terms of when we discuss the fragility versus resilience, what we are talking about in terms of the state's ability to carry out its basic functions, the state's ability to actually have a system of governing that is inclusive of the various groups within it, and also it's able to be in have vulnerability to external and internal shocks. That it's not vulnerable, it could withstand it. So when we say it could withstand internal versus external shocks, we say this state is resilient because it's able to do that. Now, when we look at the Jordanian state, we cannot really discuss the case of Jordan without looking at the composition of the societal segments and also the nature of the state. And here I would like to look at the notions of the viability, looking at Scotch Paul's discussion over what would actually characterize a state as autonomous from society. And for Jordan, this is very, very critical, taking the historical makeup of Jordan and the formation of the Jordanian state as autonomous from society by the British, and the contract that was struck at the time between 1921 to 1946, or more like 56, where there is this monarchy is established, there is a social contract between it and the societal groups that existed at the time, the merchants and the peasants. The British will maintain and administer the state in return for allegiance to the powers at the time. This same structure still continues, but had so many cracks. That is why now we are asking about the political crisis leading to a revolution, one of which is that the state was able and has been able to continue as autonomous patrimonial state. This has been supported by the generous grants that Jordan receives from US, whether in terms of US aid or even direct congressional earmarkings. Secondly, in terms of the support that it receives from the Gulf. Now, one can ask, and we all know this, why is that case? Why is the support given to Jordan, considering that Jordan, in terms of what it can do other than in comparison to Gulf states, the rentier nature of Jordan is because of its geopolitical position, and currently because of what would happen in terms of the peace process. So this significance has enabled the state to actually continue its patrimonial role, patron-client relations vis-a-vis the citizens, and I will later discuss them as the subjects that Jordan has. So this nature of patrimonial linkages enabled the Jordanian state to continue on its social contract with the citizens. Now, this is one aspect. When we look actually at the state, what would constitute a state breakdown? Now, the second aspect that we would need to look at is in terms of the state's inclusionary and exclusionary politics. The Jordanian state, throughout its history, has witnessed several bouts of demonstration, several bouts of crisis. We're starting in '89 when the regime liberalized the political process, allowing for parliamentary elections. And we had also the bread riots, the riots in the south over lifting of subsidies with the structural adjustment program. So these bouts of political unrest are not new. And the regime's sort of response to them is also not new. I mean, reading, for us that follow Jordan's political developments, it becomes very boring, actually, because the regime repeats itself. It repeats the same game. I hope I'll get back to Jordan tomorrow. So they repeat taking the same measures of opening political opening and political liberalization rather than democratization. So what we see is, I call the facade of democratization.
Facade or facade?
So they allow for responding minimally to demands. So, for example, the demands for increased representation in parliamentary elections. This was seen by the opposition as a major success in putting forth the demand that it should be proportional representation and changing of the electoral law so that it will be more representative. The electoral law is based on the giving more weight to East Bank Jordanian strongholds. So, for example, Karak in the south had in the previous electoral law 9 seats with a population that is very small compared to Amman, which has only 5 seats in terms of proportions. So, 5 minutes? Okay. So what we see is that the regime actually accepted this, that they will change the electoral law, giving 20% or 20 seats actually to be through proportional representation. But at the same time, it gave weight again to the different areas where the regime has the support, such as quotas in the south for women, which means that actually it will be East Bank Jordanians. So in trying to summarize now in 5 minutes, I will try to touch on what would constitute then a regime breakdown. One is that if we have to look at the state autonomy, as I covered, that it has to be actually excessive centralization inaccessibility of the elite institution, and structural failures of state institutions that would lead to socioeconomic failures at the same time. And these would constitute the elements of the political crisis. What we see in Jordan actually is there are elements of this, but it is not total. For us to say that this political crisis is grave enough that it will lead to a revolutionary movement such as what took place in Tunisia and Egypt. And one of the reasons for that is there is a very strong hold of the regime on playing with the two cards that exist in Jordan, the East Bank, West Bank, Jordanians of East Bank, West Bank origin. Because as much as the opposition has unified demands, and in that it includes East Bank Jordanians and West Bank Jordanians, and is calling for the anti-corruption measures, calling for actually even questioning the Queen's lavish lifestyle, and calling for political reform. Yet the rift is there and is being played by the regime, whereby the East Bank Jordanians, they have asked for, in some cases, for overthrow of the regime, and they have crossed red lines. And it's the first time in Jordan that they were allowed to cross red lines, which means that you actually say overthrow the king or curse the king, which I will not do. So what they have allowed this, but what they have done is basically use this rift, because for the East Bank Jordanians, while they're asking for parliamentary electoral reforms, they do not want the representation to be distributed differently, because that means more Jordanians of West Bank origin, of Palestinian origin, will be in parliament. Secondly, the Islamic Action Front is the only force able to actually galvanize mass support, yet at the same time, for East Bank Jordanians, they see that any increase in parliamentary representation will lead to more IAF, Islamic Action Front presence, and the majority of the rank and file of the Islamic Action Front are Palestinians. A third aspect is that with any shifts in terms of the economic structures, because this is the major grievance, and here I think we join in terms of, for Bahrain, economic grievances have led to the mass demonstrations, because not only the cutting of fuel subsidies, Jordanians of East Bank origin are mostly rural. This was their basis of support, landowners. Yes, this has changed, but in terms of where they could actually be employed is in the state structures, the police force, the security. This gives the regime strength, because it means its base of support is there, yet at the same time with the economic crisis, it means that the poverty, for the most part, is East Bank Jordanian. And this is the case, actually. It's not in refugee camps. It is mostly among East Bank Jordanians, because their salaries is below the poverty line, whether in the government or in the military, despite the attempts by the regime to actually increase the salaries for the military and increase the benefits for the retirees. But so, in conclusion, what we are seeing is that in every aspect, for regime maintenance and regime sustenance, there are cracks, but these cracks are not so deep that they will lead to a revolution in the short term. One of the reasons is that, like I mentioned, the regime playing with the same tactics it used of playing the East Bank, West Bank card. Secondly, its geopolitical importance and continued aid to Jordan. Thirdly, that the regime has perfected the art of slow reforms, establishing committees for looking at the national agenda, committees for looking at corruption, committees for looking at anti-corruption. So it has done all these aspects and has survived throughout them. But also, and this is where I will end in terms of the measure it took for socioeconomic reform, whether in terms of taking some cases to trial for corruption, but they ended up really not. They are sitting in jail or in London, but there has been an attempt. But what we will see is that the regime has stronghold over the mukhabarat still, despite the notions that it weakened a bit. And this was in the latest interview with the king. It still has a stronghold over the army, over the police force, over the administration, because it's mostly made up of East Bank Jordanians. So the different aspects that make up a strong state remain there. Yes, it's exhibiting parts of its fragility. And I think one of the issues when we look at state-societal relations, and that's, I would end up with that, is in terms of the notion of citizenship. An autonomous state, a strong, capable state, has to have strong relations in terms of its inclusionary policy vis-a-vis the citizens. In the case of Jordan, I argue, as a monarchy, and by definition, they are subjects, not citizenship, not citizens. And in that, we can see actually this question, and I will really just finish with this, is that who is a citizen in Jordan? Citizenship can be taken depending on your Palestinian card, whether yellow, green. It can be included if you are, after the disengagement, taken away, questioned at every point. For East Bank Jordanians, the case is not different. If you're a Jordanian female, you are actually, not, I consider myself not a citizen, because I don't have a relationship directly with the state. It's mediated through the same, as late King Hussein used to say, the one family, al-usra al-wahida, that it's paternal. All my relationship with the states are mediated versus the family book, which defines who I am, not my children. It has to be paternally based. So the same with the Jordanians at large. They are subjects, and as subjects, they can be granted benefits that can be withdrawn and taken from them. Thank you. Thank you.
My first question to Bassam about the social forces he described in Syria. Who represent them, and how you perceive their links to regional and international forces very active in the Syrian crisis? The second question to Ala, what are the prospects for the victory of the Bahraini revolution? Thank you.
You mean the social forces that I talked about in my paper, the business networks? I didn't address the actual uprising and the divisions. I talked about the business community and its relations with the state. Do you want me to talk about the current situation? I mean, I'm trying to avoid that. Okay, I mean, can you please be specific? I mean, seriously, what do you want me to address? Oh, okay, I see the people. I see. Who represents them? Well, that's the problem. We're talking about, statistically speaking, we're talking about a process that started in the middle 80s and, well, kind of ended in 2011, whereby the majority of the Syrian people who were actually benefiting from the redistributive policies of the state have actually stopped benefiting in any significant form, especially after the late 1990s and early 2000s, which was compounded actually by the drought. They are not represented, actually. They're not represented in parties, because Syrians are usually not represented by political parties unless you are represented by the governing party. And the only representation that they used to have before the 1980s was labor unions, the General Federation of Trade Unions in Syria, which actually became co-opted by the regime right at the site of the economic crisis in the 1980s. So even those unions stopped representing them. Hence, we saw a very quiet shift from a kind of body politique that was more left or center left in nature towards social conservatism. The social conservatism was muted in the sense that you would go to Syria between 1991 and 2011 and you see people on the streets and you talk to them, you cab drivers, you actually go to events, and you see kind of muted conservatism that is building up but is not manifesting itself in any kind of political expression for obvious reasons in Syria. And you now see its manifestation. And when people are confused and when people are upset and when people are critical of, which I am as well, of the direction of the Syrian uprising and blame everything on various kinds of forces, whether it's the move to the right or whether it is support from the outside, the initial structural rationale and reason for that allows foreign meddling and that allows for this kind of desperate move towards the right, whether it's Jabhat al-Nusra or others, is actually the regime policies over 40 years. And this is actually what is missing from the discourse, because we focus so much, again, on the sensationalist material, but we don't focus on how this supposedly leftist, socialist regime has itself adopted the quote-unquote policies and approaches and sometimes ethics of a previous era that marginalized most Syrians. So when the political elite in Syria, again, reached power in its various manifestations, because the Ba'ath is not one thing, but even throughout, but especially after 1970, they actually became the economic elite. And this is what I'm trying to address. They became the economic elite, and they actually ended up impoverishing and or marginalizing the majority of Syrians over a period of 30 years under the rubric first of socialism and then after 2005 of the social market economy. So the losers are the Syrian people, the majority of the Syrian people, and I'm not talking about 80 or 90%, I'm talking about definitely a majority, definitely more than 60%. The loser also in Syria is the productive health of the economy. The economy in Syria is in shambles whether or not the regime falls, whether or not another group takes over, which is actually a huge problem, because when you have an economy in shambles, you are inviting foreign investment, and you're actually inviting trouble, because with foreign investment comes all kinds of conditionalities, which means autonomy in Syria is actually, is going to be probably gone. So we're talking about the majority of Syrians that are not represented, and unfortunately, they're now being represented in ways that are unpleasant to many.
Can I get that microphone? Well, it's clear that not just Bahrain, that most of the revolutions are going into long haul. So the short-term ecstasy and pace is over now. Everyone's kind of redirecting themselves. I mean, there's a lot of risks in that, and I think across the Arab world, all of the revolutions in Egypt, in Tunisia, they're all kind of stopping now, reflecting, seeing what to do. I mean, at this stage, despondency begins to seep in, inertia begins to seep in the movements, activists are very frustrated. It feels sometimes, I wouldn't say it feels hopeless, but it feels like, gosh, it's not as easy as we thought. We need to kind of really gather and rethink strategies. But specifically about Bahrain, I mean, like my other paper is about Saudi phantom sovereignty, that Bahrain's a Saudi client state. And it seems the problem is that even the opposition seems to accept that fact, that whenever there seems to be talks of a negotiated settlement, there's a visit to Riyadh. There's connections. The FT has a headline, Saudi contacts someone in the opposition. So it just seems like unsaid that the decision lies in Riyadh for Bahrain. It's not really a Bahraini independent. Neither the regime is independent nor the opposition is calling for independence, the mainstream opposition. So, I mean, it's difficult to tell. It can go either way. I mean, the repression, where is that going to lead to? Are people going to retreat and gather again? Is it going to be the final crackdown? I mean, Bahrain's security services, I would argue, are really dominated by Western and particularly British expat consultants from head to toe. I'm talking about the dogs. The training company that trains the canine dogs is a British company, all the way up to the top advisors are British. So this is, the use of surveillance, this is a slow way of just blunting the uprising in a very slow, with as minimum of human rights abuse as possible, so to kind of silence the international community over human rights, but to really deal that final blow and end it there. So, I mean, it can go either way. And I still see the street sustaining its movement. It's going back, it's regathering, coming back again. But after 2.5 years, if this lasts for 4, 5, 6, 7 years, where is that going to lead to? But then again, we see changes in the rest of the GCC. So in Kuwait, in the UAE, talks of reform, the Gulf is, the society in the Gulf is changing as well. They've seen the West, the kind of language that they use to describe, for example, the UAE, the families of the UAE, 100 UAE people, prisoners have been arrested. The kind of language they use is something that, it's a new lexicon, it's a new language in Gulf society that's changing, looking more focused at rights and more focused on justice and corruption. Especially in the Saudi, it's picking up socially. I mean, I've met with activists in Kuwait and in Saudi Arabia. So I think it's just it's all up in the air, but things are changing in the Gulf massively.
Just a quick comment first. I was very struck by that. You reminded me instantly of East Timor's relationship with Indonesia. And East Timor didn't finally become independent after a very long struggle until there was massive change and transformation in 98 years in Indonesia. Maybe that's what happens next for Bahrain, but until there's a big change in Saudi Arabia, there's not going to be that big change in Bahrain. I have a sort of social science question for the whole panel, which is, Bassam asked a question right at the start, how to explain why the uprising started or happened in some countries and not in others. And I want to take that from that very broad level to the micro level of why and how it happened, how civic activism or grassroots mobilization happened in this village or this town or this city neighborhood or this factory and not in that. And I just want to bring in a book by Stathis Kalivas who discussed the role of violence in civil wars. And he drew a lot of insight from the Greek Civil War in particular and others. And again, to go from this sort of level where you think the communists versus the dictatorship or the Shia versus the Sunnis or the opposition versus the Assad regime, these very broad categories which are legitimate. But then to work out in terms of understanding the new types of civic activism and what drives it, what works, what doesn't work, and why it happens or doesn't happen. If you can give us some insight on the micro level of why in these villages in Said or in the Delta something happened and something else that happens. Where do they vote? Where don't they vote? Exactly.
Okay, so first of all, Yazid, I think that's the right question. And I don't think social science is particularly good at predicting things. It's good at understanding things in retrospect, which is why a historian like me could be a social scientist. And the second edition of the book that I co-edited with Frédéric Varel, which is called Social Movements, Mobilization, and Contestation in the Middle East and North Africa, actually tries to address exactly that question in the 3 new chapters on Tunisia, Syria, and Yemen. And in all of those cases, as well as the Egyptian case, which we rewrote the chapter for, the dynamic is a particular social network. So if I talk about factories in Egypt, for example, let's take the biggest one. It's the easiest one, Misr Spinning and Weaving in Mahal al-Kubra. The trade union elections of 2006 were the most corrupt ever, and the security forces eliminated from the list of candidates anybody who they thought would be troublesome at all. Leftists, independents, Muslim Brothers, whatever. Those people became the leaders of the strike that broke out 2 months after the election. And they already had a network because they had been campaigning for election. So they were able to lead 2 extremely effective strikes, which won major economic demands. Paradoxically, and similar sorts of things went on in many other workplaces, both public sector and private sector. About 1/3 of all the labor actions in the 2000s were in the private sector, 2/3 in the public business or the governmental sector. So that's the general dynamic in all of the workplaces, some exceptional things, of course. And paradoxically, the very fact that those local networks were very strong also meant that they were limited. So the leaders in Mahala al-Kubra could not form a Delta-wide textile workers counter-union to the official trade union because they don't know each other and they don't trust each other in the same way. These people who led the strikes in Mahala, in Shabin, in Kafra Dawar, their kids are married to each other, they go to school with each other, their wives lend each other money in the savings association, they live in the same neighborhoods. That can't be replicated on a regional or even a national level. So if you add on to that the fact that they are, to begin with, distrustful of any urban intelligentsia, and the urban intelligentsia behave arrogantly towards them, so they're right to distrust them. So they are both isolated from the parallel social movement of the urban intelligentsia, kifaya, and all of those still associated kinds of things that happened in the 2000s, but they're also isolated from each other. So it was only after Mubarak was ousted that you could have the formation of an independent trade union federation, the Egyptian Federation of Independent Trade Unions, which is unfortunately split on, it's too complicated to get into, so now there's also the Egyptian Democratic Labor Congress. But these are fledgling organizations with minimal resources, with very little experience of how you actually run a democratic trade union, which still, for good reasons, mistrust the oppositional intelligentsia, which rarely speaks about their issues at all. The National Salvation Front, for example, has no presence in factories and other workplaces. Some a little bit in the government sector, but not much beyond that. So these kinds of limitations on the way that the local networks function, in the Egyptian case, I think also in the Tunisian case, which is the only other one I know in any detail at all, are still pretty substantial.
Did you want to take a crack at it?
And turn your microphone on too.
As well. Before I got involved in political activism, I was actually, I did my PhD in econometrics, so I was an economist by training, and it was all about forecasting models. Why didn't the economists forecast the financial crisis? And there was all of this defensive, apologetic approach by economists of like, we didn't see it coming. We knew it would happen, we didn't see it coming. And as well, all of the social scientists now, we knew everyone's been predicting revolution in the Arab world for like the last 50 years, but they just didn't know when. So the key question is, the factors were there, underlying simmering factors in all of these countries, but the question was why did it happen at that particular moment? Or why, when the same factors seem to be repeating themselves, it doesn't get replicated, for example, in Jordan? I have no answer. I mean, I was in Bahrain at the time when the February 14th movement hit off. And, there were whimmerings between messages like, are you going to go out? And no one could conceive what was going to happen that day, like whether there was going to be one or two local protests or that you're going to see huge people pouring on the streets. You just didn't know. But people had decided to do it individually, and then it became a collective outpouring. How that happened, it's a mystery. It's one of the reasons why I believe in God. Thanks.
Abla?
Thank you. I think it's a very critical question. If we look at, for the case of Jordan, it's easier when we dissect the different groupings, because then one can understand it. For the East Bank Jordanians, as I mentioned, it's a breakup of the unwritten social contract they had with the state, with the regime, basically, that we will give you loyalty and legitimacy and a legitimizing factor for the regime. In return, the patrimonial patron-client relation that they have enjoyed, access to public service, access to the benefits that come from enlistment in the army, whether it's consumer shops, etc. This social contract is now being renegotiated. And that's what the East Bank Jordanians want, a renegotiation of the social contract, because they feel that the basis of it has been taken away. The state with its financial crisis is unable to continue this patronage. At the same time, they see with the increased privatization of state-owned enterprises that went to some elites in the mukhabarat, intelligence, and in the private sector, it meant that there is this corruption is actually dividing the East Bank Jordanians themselves by fostering an elite structure of East Bank Jordanians. They also see that the benefits of all the economic growth and modernization that the king has focused on is not going to the East Bank Jordanians, but to the predominantly Palestinian Jordanians of Palestinian origin who are in the business sector. So what we see, as much as I don't like this break of Jordanians as East Bank, West Bank, because we're all Jordanians, yet at the same time, these are what leading to the riots in the Jordanian towns. And at the same time, this is not the only group that is there demonstrating. The youth movement is made up as well of different nationalists, leftists, and the social media youth that were scared off after they broke down the 24th March protest. And the regime actually played on those fears by having a lot of the reports that the Islamists infiltrated the demonstrations, that you will see what's taking place in Syria will be replicated in Jordan. So the regime has really been very successful in playing on those fears. The only group that I would say that can galvanize more and can actually perhaps bring more support is the Islamic Action Front, because it's unified. But fears of what's going in Syria and the regime playing on that may weaken the Islamic Action Front's ability to actually have more mass demonstrations that bring different groups together. Thank you.
Bassam?
Every time I hear the word king, I have to look at the calendar. It's 2013. أنا في سب الملك معلش.
أنا سبيته.
Thanks, Yazid, for this question. I think we do have to distinguish between two levels: what's happening across the region and what's happening within each country. And on both counts, if we look, I'm actually writing something on this question of, why not in X places. And there are many variables, but I would like to just focus quickly on three variables that are very important in understanding some of the basic divisions across cases in the region and why some did not join a mass uprising. Resources, the existence of resources is extremely important, and we're talking primarily about natural resources like oil, but also other resources. Second, the question of distribution across all sectors generally, and distribution/discrimination against certain communities and sectors. And third, state society mediation, whether it has to do with civil society activism or the social contract or political party life. So if you look at the countries that actually have oil, rentier states, they did not join the uprisings in full force, except for two cases, Bahrain and Libya. If you look at Bahrain and Libya, and this is relatively crude, of course, but if you look at Bahrain and Libya, you notice a couple of things. There is a problem with distribution in general in Libya. So you have a question of this major problem of distribution, even in a homogeneous society or relatively homogeneous society, even if there are tribal affiliations. So that is one problem. The other problem in Libya is social mediation. Mr. Gaddafi actually eliminated any semblance of mediation between state and society to a great extent. And that's why he had to actually buy, a fighting force. He had to hire mercenaries to actually fight, as opposed to the other cases where you didn't actually have to do that as a regime in power. The case of Bahrain, you have a question of distribution across communities and discrimination despite the presence of oil rents. So this can, preliminarily explain this differential. But also in places like Syria, the distinction is in terms of region, manatiqi and otherwise. In the case of Syria, the economic policies and the drought combined together impoverished the countryside, and the small towns where the uprising actually started was more intense, and it's still most intense. And that actually was compounded by the fact that the migrating individuals and families went everywhere, including the 2 metropolitan cities and the small towns, and places from Dar'a to Idlib to Homs and elsewhere. The issue was that these towns, these smaller towns and smaller cities were not able to absorb this migration. And the devastation, economic and otherwise, and infrastructural problems and deficiencies created a kind of atmosphere that was very volatile. And of course, that explains, for instance, the sense in which the first year in the Syrian uprising was very much of a rural, small town affair. In the metropolitan cities in Aleppo and Damascus, not only were these cities able to absorb the migration as a result of better infrastructure, higher standard of living, and so on, but they also benefited between 2003 and 2007 from the inflow of Iraqi capital coming from Baghdad, because thankfully in the region we have a lot of the catastrophes that we only remember them when we start thinking about how they were affected by others. So we forgot about the Iraqi ongoing catastrophe, of course, but that catastrophe created a real estate bubble in Damascus and Aleppo that actually allowed Damascus and Aleppo to stand a bit more firmly despite what has been happening, and of course not forever. So I would like to just throw out these three factors of resources, distribution / discrimination, and mediation of social relations between state and society, and distinguish also within countries between different regions within each case, but that's just a preliminary answer.
Salah, do you have a microphone? Then just keep that one.
صالح عبد الجواد، دائرة العلوم السياسية، جامعة بير زيت. بيجوز أهداف المؤتمر هذا محاولة التوفيق بين المقاربة الجيوبوليتيكية اللي بتعتمد على التاريخ اللي قدمها بالتحديد الدكتور رشيد الخالدي، وبين الابروتش المقاربة الثانية والثالثة اللي هي مقاربة الاقتصاد السياسي تبع الأستاذ بسام، وكمان شوي عماوي وحقوق الإنسان. يعني المقاربتين هدول فيهم لو بدنا ناخذ الحالة السورية بيحصل تناقض. اذا اخذنا الحل الابروتش الجيوبوليتيكال اوكي، واللي هو كثير بيستند على التاريخ ومخاوف التاريخ، بنلاقينا صفينا الى جنب النظام بدرجه ما، في حين اذا اخذنا الاقتصاد السياسي وخصوصا حقوق الانسان والليبراليه بنلاقينا بالجو الاخر. السؤال، هل في امكانيه انه نحاول نوجد، خلينا نقول، توليفه اللي تقارب بينها وتشوف مين له الاولويه في مرحله تاريخيه محدده؟ بدي بالنسبه للاردن، بيروقراطيه الدوله في الاردن زي ما قالت، هي الاماره بدات بدون موافقه من المجتمع المدني الاردني، بدات بعقد مع تشرشل، واللي حصل انه البيروقراطيه في الاردن بالاساس اساسا ما كانتش اردنيه، رؤساء الوزارات وهذا كانوا شوام وفلسطينيين والى اخره. اللي صار في السبعين لما حصل المواجهه مع المقاومه الاردنيه وانشق الجيش الاردني، الملك حسين او النظام بشكل عمل سياسه الارض، اردنه النظام، جوردانايزيشن، ويعني البيروقراطية تحولت إلى بيروقراطية أردنية وكانت مبسوطة في رواتبها، إلها امتيازات، تدخل الجامعات، إلها أولويات. المشكلة أنت بتحكي على قصة يعني عرضك رائع الحقيقة، بدي بس أضيف له شيء بسيط إنه حتى الأردنيين ما عادوش يعني متملكين للموضوع الزراعي، بمعنى اللي حصل إنه دخولهم كانت محدودة، كانت تسمح لهم، وفي السبعينات اللي حصل الفلسطينيين اللي بطلوا يقدروا يدخلوا النظام تحولوا للتجارة، وكمان المداخيل اللي اجت فسمحت لهم كمان بشراء كميات واسعه جدا من الاراضي، ولذلك كمان الفلسطينيين سيطروا على اذا بدكم الجانب العقاري، الاراضي والى اخره، وحتى المشاريع اللي اليوم في الغول الزراعيه الضخمه هي بالاساس بايدين ملاك فلسطين. وهذا ولذلك اي حقيقه اي شيء بده يصير في الاردن لازم ياخذ الحساسيه هذه حساسية جدية، مش حساسية يعني مش لعبة نظام، مش لعبة إنه النظام راح يلعب، ولازم تنشاف بمنتهى الحساسية. وشكرا.
What you refer to, of course, Syria is a perfect example, but this is politics. I mean, the whole problem in Syria, in terms of the uprising, is that, you know, people like myself living in Washington, I mean, we argue the Syrian case, or we argued, you know, before the uprising, because there was like a different kind of time, the Syrian case in terms of its regional politics, because of the reasons that you mentioned. And we pay the price for that, for sounding like we are, or for being supportive of the causes that Syria supports, that Hezbollah supports, and so on and so forth. But underneath this politics, there is something rotten. And this something rotten, هيدا الشيء المعفن, هو is the actual practice and distribution of wealth and opportunities inside Syria. النظام السوري قبل 2011 ما كان مضطر يخدم النخبة الاقتصادية لمدة 20 أو 30 سنة بطريقة فقرت كل الشعب. ما كان مضطر، ولا كان في جبهة النصرة، ولا قطر. Actually Qatar was giving the regime money, and Kuwait was giving the regime money, and Saudi Arabia was giving the regime money. The Syrian regime was not forced to support the economic elite and impoverish its society, and it was sovereign. ما في أحرار الشام، وما في تركيا، وما في أردوغان، وما في برهان غليون، وما في أمريكا، وما في إسرائيل، وما في قطر والسعودية. There is something problematic that is rotten, that is very deep. So okay, and then you look at Israel and the United States, and you look at regional politics, and you look at Zionism, and you look at settlement, racist, apartheid, expansion, and settler colonialism, and you look at the dominance of oil wealth, and you think that Syria might be playing some role in supporting resistance, supporting Hezbollah, supporting Hamas, and so on and so forth. So that confusion is natural, but it's a question of responsibility, and responsibility should be addressed to the question of power. When we talk about America or Israel or any other place that we actually can be critical of, we talk about power relations. You cannot equate A and B. You have to look at who has the power of initiative and power in general. In the case of Syria, inside Syria, the regime had the power, had the sovereignty, and it really screwed things up over 30 years in the name of socialism, except that it was actually capitalist par excellence. So the regime is responsible for what is happening today. And whether or not it was fighting monsters outside, inside it was trampling on its citizens. So I don't see a contradiction. I see a contradiction, but it is not difficult to understand. When you look at the issue of responsibility, if this regime was not sovereign, if it was controlled from the outside, we can say, okay, it was a different issue. But the regime was firmly in control internally. And this is what it did. So when we're upset that Jabhat al-Nusra is taking over, of course it's not, it's an exaggeration. And when we were upset about the direction of the Syrian uprising, even if we support the sentiment behind the uprising originally, let's not forget who is responsible for allowing all these problematic actors to meddle in Syria, and now just act like we're against that and forget who is responsible. There's a lack of courage and lack of dignity and lack of integrity in doing so. So it's life. It's not a contradiction.
I just would like to point one issue related to the point you raised, is that, yes, the divide in terms of East Bank, West Bank is not new. But if we look at what is new, is that after 1970s and Black September, it was an issue that we were not allowed to talk about. It was hushed. And so the regime really worked under King Hussein to bring the society together by really not looking at this issue, which was continued under King Abdullah initially, but then with the increased economic impoverishment of the Jordanian, this issue resurfaced. So what you see, and that's what is new, is that the regime is allowing the Jordanians to voice these concerns. And if you remember, a few years ago, Al-Abbadi was put in jail because he dared ask that questions, that Palestinians, Jordanians of West Bank origin are not Jordanians. Now, this is common, everybody is talking about it. So it's becoming an issue that is allowed to be talked about. Similarly, the red line of cursing the regime and the king in particular has been passed in the streets, and that is sort of tolerated. So that is what is new. It's a tactic that is being played. But what the game is, with the impoverishment, then comes the counter attack by the East Bank Jordanians of saying, okay, where are the strongholds of what they see as Jordanians of Palestinian origin is in the political realm, along with the economic. So while they cannot fight the economic other than say, stop corruption, stop privatization, we need distribution of this wealth, they're fighting to stop constitutional amendment by saying, let's go back to the 1952 constitution, which actually reserved a lot of the powers of the king. And they don't want far reforms in terms of the constitution. The same with the electoral reform. They want to stop it to a point that they still are protected. And so this is the game they're playing as well, that we will continue the allegiance if you don't go far enough in the political reform. So they're asking for that, but with limited political reform, not as much as the Islamic Action Front, for example, or some of the youth movements are asking.
Shehabi. My question actually to Abla, I want to return back to the trans in Jordan. And I'm actually, rather than trans Jordan, thinking of trans subjects, that especially with Iraqis and Syrians right now. And I think Bassam alluded to these kind of major transformations that happened since 2003 with, large-scale demographic transitions and people moving from one place to the other, changing kind of constituencies within each country, especially Syria and Jordan. Especially now Jordan is looking now more like this stable place where refugees can move to. So I'm wondering how is the Iraqi factor or the Syrian factor with the kind of both its economic and also its non-national presence is affecting. I mean, you'll probably know the last couple of days with the Iraqi embassy crisis, and many Jordanians were asked to put their Jordanian flag to indicate that they are Jordanian, not Iraqi or. So I'm wondering how does that either hinder or push further the quest for reform or revolution or uprising?
Pass it back to Barbara, and then Barbara, you'll pass it to the gentleman in the back row. We'll take all three questions, and then everybody can answer.
Yes, I'm Barbara Ibrahim from American University in Cairo, and I want to tie together two really interesting presentations on Egypt and Bahrain. Joel, I always agree with you up to a point, and I want to talk about maybe that 10% a little bit, and ask you to perhaps disaggregate registered NGOs and civil society a little bit in Egypt, because as we were looking at what was happening in the last decade, it became very clear that the youth organized and founded and run NGOs looked very different from a previous generation of those organizations. So they were more lateral, they were more networked, they were much more likely to look more like movements and the 6th of April political organizations than they were to look like place-bound and small projects that are typically the way we think about NGOs. So just maybe to think a little bit about why that made it possible for those young people to spill over very easily into Tahrir, to be organizing the social services there and in other cities, and to give the revolution the character that it had. And I think by not recognizing this generational difference, we've also failed to help those young people get to the table and to negotiate the future of the country. Their lateral and networked nature means that they don't have leaders and they don't have hierarchy and they don't put forward leaders. That leads me then to your very interesting presentation on Bahrain, and maybe just to learn from the fact that our revolution was way too short. And so in 18 days, we had enough time to organize around what we didn't want, but we really weren't prepared and we weren't laid out with what we did want to rebuild. And to just ask you whether within these groups within Bahrain, there's real thinking about what citizenship will look like under a republic, how ethnicity will be dealt with, and how you will deal with the nuts and bolts issues that others have talked about, like resource sharing in the new Bahrain. Thank you.
Pass the mic back to the gentleman back. Okay.
Fawaz Rabulsi, AUB, Pakistan. I want to take up the issue of human rights. I think both in Joel Beinin and Abla Shehabi was raised an issue which is not always being raised, which I can put in this way. Had 25 years of state civil society paradigm succeeded, would we have had the revolutions? Which brings to mind that we are celebrating a new institution on civil society and citizenship without any revision of 25 years of how neoliberalism hijacked all that we're talking about, citizenship, civil rights, etc. Isn't that some aberration? Don't you think so? The other thing, I think civil rights society have done a marvelous job compared to other civil rights organizations. But one thing should be asked in the light of political economy. Did we restrict civil rights to personal and public freedoms, forgetting other rights like social rights? I mean, who was funded to study social rights in the Arab world for 25 years? By this I mean those silly things like the right to work. We have the world record for unemployment in the world and the world record for unemployment of the youth in the world. But when youth came, we studied leadership, not work. And Mr. Friedman wants to tell us that you create your own job, which is fantastic. I mean, for 100 million Arabs who would be looking for jobs in 15 years, Mr. Thomas Friedman tells you, you create your own jobs. But last, I think the youth has been underprivileged in this as representing the future and as a main participant in this revolution. And by youth, I don't mean middle-class citizens or youth. I mean youth in general. I mean the millions of Syrian youth in the countryside are still youth. The millions of Syrians who now occupy 50% of Ashwaiyat in Syria. This is official statistics. 50% of the Syrians live outside legal apartments. 50%. We talk about the Ashwaiyat of Cairo. Let's think about the Ashwaiyat of Syria. But I mean, I might conclude by adding, no wonder, because such rights as education, work, health, a safe environment, health, are all due to be privatized. So they would not necessarily enter in the category of rights. So what about social rights again? Thank you.
Pass the mic, Richard. Karima will also make one comment. Here. And then we'll just go down the line, starting with Bassam for answers.
Hi, thank you for your patience. I'm Karima Khalil. I'm from Cairo and I study these groups. And my comment is addressed to Joel Beinin, and I'm pronouncing that right. And basically, I think I disagree with you. I just want to make sure that I understood you correctly. So all I want from you is a yes or no answer, because I'll explain tomorrow why I disagree with you in my talk. But did I understand you correctly? Am I paraphrasing you correctly if I say that you, what you call the youth Facebook generation, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, but am I paraphrasing correctly if you said that youth who had the least to do with revolutionary activity and activism on the ground and movement on the ground are largely now being co-opted by Western funding, and that they turn themselves into NGOs and therefore become part of the counter-revolutionary activity by default. Did I understand you correctly? Paraphrasing you roughly. Yes. If that passes, okay, then I'll say why I disagree with you tomorrow afternoon.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I will just address Fawaz's point on civil society. Setting aside the political and historical and social dimensions of the term civil society, because the term is actually a function of a particular era and a particular formula. So, and that could be actually quite problematic in just, using it. However, I just want to agree with Fawaz's critique and say that with the question of civil society, there are two things. There's the function of civil society, again, setting aside the antecedents, the function of civil society and the description or definition of civil society as to what it is. What it is supposedly is a collection of associations that represent groups. The function is that it serves, among other functions, mainly it serves as a buffer between the individual and the state, and actually preserves and protects rights and so on. And I think the study of civil society, which allowed for neoliberal approaches and dimensions to absorb civil society and count within it all kinds of things that were actually anti-democratic, is a function of the emphasis on the definition of civil society, not on the function, not on what it does. Hence, and I participated in a project which is now produced as a book, precisely on this topic of civil society, called Unusual Suspects of Civil Society. In other words, looking at groups that actually emerge from quote unquote within civil society, but serve the opposite purpose of what a civil society should serve. And they undermine democracy, they undermine group empowerment, they undermine all the good things that we think about when we think about civil society. So I think a critical approach to this question, with focus on citizenship and rights, individual rights and collective rights, is the way to go in refashioning civil society. Otherwise, I think we would be repeating the same problem. So it's kind of challenging, but there is an exit, even if we still use the term, by focusing on the function, not just the definition. And the question of business associations, both in Egypt and Syria and elsewhere, is a fantastic example of how through civil society they became dominant, and they are responsible for the kinds of exploitation that brought masses to the streets. And these are civil society associations. So there is something to be said about that.
Okay, I'll just comment on the Transjordan trans subjects. I like the term very much, and I call actually a lot of the groups that came to Jordan because of the unfortunate situations in the different countries, lost in translation rather than lost in transition. Because and the reason I say that is it takes us back to the difference between a state and a nation state. And that's we answered, Jordan became a state, whether it became a nation state. Previously, we used to say, yes, it did, because there is the sense of nationalism. Now, with the recent developments and the fact that you have the estimated Syrians will constitute 2 million, and how many Iraqis are there, we have also some Libyans and Yemenis, is that these are not citizens, they are subjects. Many of them have citizenship. And a lot of the Syrians will be getting citizenship, especially if they are investing in Jordan, which means that, again, the definition of the citizen versus the state, and the definition of the subject. And to just comment on, this is the aspects of the fragility of the Jordanian state. Who does it include, and who does it, which groups does it exclude? And here, even within inclusion, there are very different levels. And for the civil societies, I think I did not mention that they have been very active in terms of the demonstrations, the different labor unions, associations, the NGOs, and specifically those foreign heavily funded NGOs that used to get a lot of grants for democracy purposes. They are more on the quiet side because they don't want to be seen as politically active, which might be harmful to their funding status. But the rest of the different groups within civil society are very active. And it's interesting to say that many of the groups in civil society, and now I'm not talking only civil society organizations, are reverting back to their primordial ties, whether it's the tribe conglomerate, whether it's the different ashire, hamule, to protect them, because this is now what keeps them vis-a-vis the state. And the final thing is that they also taking the notion of monopoly over the legitimate use of force is no longer applicable in some instances. Because really, if you look at Jordanian events, you think it's cowboys now. With every violence within universities, there is violence within the tribes, tribal fights against the state. So there is the legitimate use of force has been replaced by illegitimate use of force in many instances.
Three relatively short points, I hope. First, I agree entirely with the import of Fawaz's question. The whole construct of state civil society, the way it was promoted in the West, especially in the United States, since the mid-1980s, was as an accompaniment to the neoliberal project. And all the NGOs that were funded via that were ultimately linked to that in one way or another. Second, to Barbara's question, yes, I agree there is a generational difference. I didn't have the time to read all that part of the paper, but that generation in Egypt is very comparable, for example, to the Occupy Wall Street movement. Had very similar social structures and were dissipated in very much the same way because there wasn't a hierarchical political structure. The issue is not the existence of hierarchy or the non-existence of hierarchy. The question is, do you build political institutions? That means ultimately a political party, because that's how you change a regime, and that's what we didn't have anywhere in the Arab world, viable oppositional political parties. That's the key. So, and to Karima, I'll just read 3 sentences so that you'll know what you don't agree with exactly. The Facebook youth, while their role was important, have received exaggerated attention and credit because they are essentially like us, the West. Young professionals or would-be professionals using technologies and ideologies imported from the West. Egypt's Facebook youth were typically 20 or 30-somethings from the middle classes with good technical or business educations and the skills to compete in a free market, but they did not have the ties to President Mubarak's son Gamal, which would have enabled them to benefit from the crony neoliberal capitalist project. So these people, Wael Ghonaim, living in Dubai, Walid Rashid, living in Qatar, Isra Abdel Fattah, who established a Facebook page to support the strike that actually didn't happen on April 6, 2008, and who never met a worker in her life and was arrested for 2 weeks, disappeared from politics completely until January 2011 because her mother made her. That's who we're talking about. Now, I don't want to say that all of that is not important. No, it's important. But it wasn't street politics, and it was totally removed from the working class movement, and often also removed from the urban middle class movement. You did not see, for example, Isra Abdel Fattah in a Kifaya demonstration, or Ahmed Maher, whose organization split because they were angry that he's taking money from the United States, so that issue got in there as well. I mean, so some of them did participate, but the great majority of them didn't. They were on internet.
No, I'm arguing that because we've been over-focused on the human rights discourse, it has been useful because especially Bahrain has been framed as a sectarian uprising. Automatically, if you use something universal like the human rights discourse, it removes that. It doesn't matter if I'm Shia or Sunni, as long as I'm talking about rights. If I'm using a rights-based framework and talking about equality, it removes that suspicion, that tension. So it's very opportunistic in the beginning. But now we're starting to reach a dead end using that. You know, we have to think we have to form a more positive post-revolutionary conception of Bahrain will look like. But we need to create that space, because when you're in a very repressive environment with the security, you automatically have the cycle of repression and protest. You don't have the space to kind of conceive broadly what you're aspiring to. You know what you don't want. You know that you don't want the current government. You know that it's all in the negative. It's all a negative conception. It's not rather than, but what do we want? And in fact, this was highlighted to me really clearly last week. There's a UK parliamentary investigation now into the relationship between the UK, Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. A member of the opposition party was there along with my friend Mariam Lakhwaja, and the guy handed him a question on the plate. He says, you as the opposition, what would you like to see? What's your role model for Bahrain? The guy started stuttering. I mean, he's handing him a question. You're sitting in the British Houses of Parliament. Like, this should be a very easy, it doesn't need, you don't need much of a guess to say. You wouldn't think he needed much of prodding to respond positively. He's like, I think we aspire at the Moroccan model of democracy. And we were just we were fuming. But they never invited us to speak. He's like, the Moroccan model. You're sitting in that British Houses of Parliament, and you're aspiring for the Moroccan model, like the beacon of democracy in your handbook. And then I just sat there flabbergasted. I thought, we have no positive, a really positive conception of what Bahrain. We haven't allowed the space to remove ourselves from that cycle to think about what we want. What was worse was then I looked over my shoulder and spoke to his boss, the vice president of this opposition party, and said, well, what about the UK or South Africa? He said, well, again, there's problems with that as well. So we actually do not even know. It wasn't even a fumbling mistake on behalf. It was the whole party from head to bottom that just doesn't have a clue. So unfortunately, this is, I think I'll be working to kind of try and figure out how we can think all together collectively about, what is it we envision Bahrain to be.
Thank the panel and thank all of you. The lunch is served out there. We'll be back at 1:30 for Khalid Fahmi's keynote.